Hi, I'm Geoff. Welcome to my channel. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. It's going to help me grow it, and I really appreciate your help in that effort. I want to talk today about one of my favorite topics, which is field research. It's one of my favorite things to do, and this is brought to light by two stories in today's New York Times about Bernie Sanders' 1988 trip to the Soviet Union when he was mayor of Burlington, Vermont. Obviously, this particular trip has been covered extensively over the years, I think, but the New York Times brought some new information to light through the application of field research. I've linked to the two stories below so you can open them up and follow along. But this is interesting because through field research, the New York Times brought to light the Soviet side of Bernie's trip and then their subsequent trips to Burlington, Vermont after Bernie and some aldermen from the city went on that 1988 trip. So first I want to talk about what is field research. So I'm an opposition researcher by trade. I've been doing this and opposition research and strategic communications for more than 20 years now. And to me, field research is anything that doesn't exist online and is not where you are, pretty much. So if you're talking about a candidate and you're like I am in Washington, D.C., you're going to want to go to the state, to the city where they live and see what you can find. And there's so much information. We think so much information is online now, but there's so much more information that is not online, that is not searchable, that is not in a structured data format. And that's where there's a lot of opportunities to find some great stuff. And I think that, these stories reminding me that the political researcher process is quite similar, I think, to the reporting process. And if you've been a researcher or a reporter and you have some thoughts on that, please leave a comment. I'd like to hear your thoughts. But you start with looking around at the facts that are available to you, and then you start digging deeper, methodically digging through the information that you found initially, what other information needs to be found, and then go and find it, and then write up your results. That's the research process, and I've never been a journalist, but I've worked with a lot of journalists, and I think that's essentially what the reporting process is. So one question that these kinds of stories always raise to me is why now? Why were these stories written? Obviously, Bernie has a greatly increased stature now over the past few years, and certainly this year as we're in an election cycle. Until Biden's big wins in South Carolina and then on Super Tuesday, there was a moment there where Bernie Sanders was maybe on track to be the Democrats' nominee for president. And so when you have an increased stature, you start to get attention from opposition researchers and certainly from reporters. And a lot of times when these stories are reported, people wonder, why did it take so long for this story to be written? But a lot of politicians are sitting in safe seats. They're in states that aren't competitive or districts that aren't competitive. And once they got elected, no one ever went back over their record. There weren't the resources or the time via an opponent or news organizations. They have limited resources, and sometimes, no one continued digging on them. There was no motive really to do it because they weren't going anywhere. And this story, when you read through these two stories, you'll see that the reporting on this started last week before the South Carolina primary. So again, at that time, Bernie had a lot of momentum before, and Biden was kind of running on fumes. And so there's definitely, some motivation there to go explore further. Because people want, I think people want these candidates to be vetted, well vetted. That's what people like me do, and then certainly reporters do that through their reporting. when I read stories like this, I always wonder, where did they come from? Did they come from a campaign's research shop that then pitched out the story? Is it something just generated from reporter interest? And one of these stories gets into that topic, but before I answer that question, you wonder, the Elizabeth Warren's team dig at this stuff. I mean, she is kind of competing on the same turf, I think, with Bernie, but maybe trying to get some folks a little bit outside of that more progressive left part of the Democratic Party, and so maybe try to frame Bernie as even more of a fringe candidate. Unfortunately for her, this story is too late because she's already dropped out at this time, and so these kinds of stories take a long time to be reported. If a researcher like me pulls together information and pitches it to a reporter, they have to report it out. They have to talk to their editors, answer all their concerns. Sometimes they want a story based where it gets the maximum number of eyeballs on it, and that might not be when the campaign wants it to hit. There's also, you might think, well, Biden, now the race is down to Biden and Bernie. At the point this story was reported, Biden was kind of running on fumes. He hadn't had the South Carolina win yet, and I don't think would have had the resources to be doing field research in Russia. Obviously, if you've opened the stories, you've seen it was the New York Times. It came strictly from reporters' interest in their reporters in Russia, and they just got curious and started looking around, and they found this cool stuff. So a little bit about the field research process. Before you're going to pay to go travel somewhere, and a lot of times you're traveling to kind of, you're not always going to major cities that are easy to get in and out of. You're usually going to places in more like rural areas or smaller towns. You want to read all the news coverage that there is on the subject first. You want to read all their bios, anything you can get your hands on, because you want to look at all the facts that are out there, and then you want to figure out, where are the gaps? Are there does the narrative thread seem to jump from point A to point D and miss points B and C in between? Or if you're looking at someone's background and there's maybe some primary source information, like if you're reading news stories, that's secondary sources. If you're any mention of primary sources, you want to get your eyes on those yourself, because you're reading someone's interpretation of that source, and you want to look at it yourself. And then that's, as I mentioned, you want to identify the gaps, like subjects that need to be explored further. Maybe there are angles that were missed. Maybe there are some things that happened at the time you're reading a story, and people have a different view of those events or the context around them now than they did then. And also remember, news is only the first draft of history. That's what they say, and so maybe first, a lot of times first draft isn't enough. You need to look further. And this is the exact approach that the New York Times took. So if you look through these stories, the story itself, and then there's a story behind the story. The New York Times, as Bernie Sanders pushed for closer ties, Soviet Union spotted opportunity. Previously unseen documents from a Soviet archive show how Mr. Sanders worked to find a sister city in Russia when he was a mayor in the 80s. Moscow saw a chance for propaganda. Propaganda is the word that jumps out large in the story, reported by Anton Troyanovsky. I hope I got your name right. My name is spelled weird. People mispronounce my name all the time. I'm really sensitive about pronouncing people's names properly. But March 6th, 2020 in the New York Times. I'll just read a little bit of the story. The mayor of Burlington, Vermont, wrote to a Soviet counterpart in a provincial city that he wanted the United States and the Soviet Union to, quote, live together as friends. Unbeknown to him, his desire for friendship meshed with the efforts of Soviet officials in Moscow to quote, reveal American imperialism as the main source of the danger of war. That mayor was Bernie Sanders, and the story of his 1988 trip to the Soviet Union has been told before. It's been told many times before, including that he was on his that trip was served as his honeymoon with his wife. But many of the details of Mr. Sanders' Cold War diplomacy before and after that visit and the Soviet effort to exploit Mr. Sanders' anti-war agenda for their own propaganda purposes have remained largely out of sight. Key phrase. They talk a little about the field research. They examined 89 pages of letters, telegrams, and internal Soviet government documents, revealing in far greater detail the extent of Mr. Sanders' personal effort to establish ties between his city and a country many Americans then considered an enemy, despite the reforms being initiated at the time under Mikhail Gorbachev. And we'll talk more about that context in a little bit. The files were in an archive in the city of Yaroslavl, which today is still a sister city with Burlington, Vermont. The files were open to the public. The archivist there said that until now, no one had asked to see them. And this happens so many times when you go in these archives. And I'm not talking about in Russia. I'm talking about in America, where a lot of times you're the only person that asks to see this stuff. Nothing in the document suggests that Mr. Sanders was the only local American official targeted for propaganda, or even that he was particularly receptive to it, though they do describe him as a socialist. But the documents do show the Soviets' intensive preparation to use Mr. Sanders' interest in their country to their advantage. The documents were available in the Yaroslavskaya Regional State Archive in Yaroslavl. So the Times requested the file from the archive on February 27th. This is Thursday of last week, which is February 27th today. And the archives employees said they had to check the documents for personal information and redact it, which is normal. And it talks about Sanders' effort to establish a sister city, which I guess a sister city relationship with Yaroslavl, which I guess took quite a bit of lobbying, both stateside and within the then Soviet Union. So this story is accompanied by another story behind the story, searching for Sanders in a Russian archive. So this process, I guess they left the reporter in Moscow and a researcher in Moscow. They left for Yaroslavl, looks like on Wednesday, February 26th. They got there on February 27th went to the Recent History Documentation Center in Yaroslavl. It took about an hour to get, there's a lot of color in this story. It took about an hour to get some files. There's string and cardboard bound packets with titles like Documents on the Development of Foreign Relations, Creation of separate friendship societies, delegation exchanges, etc. So when a lot of this, just like the story says, the stuff sits in cardboard boxes and there's expandable files and there's strings and rubber bands and all this stuff on it. And I'm kind of weird. I get excited by that stuff because you're pretty, you just get a feeling that there's something good in there. They also flipped through the whole year's issues of the local newspaper, which is called the Northern Worker. Again, I doubt it looks like the Northern Workers, 1988 editions are not online. So you go to these libraries, you find these big, sometimes they're big bound volumes of the old paper, and you just have to flip through page by page by page, scanning through them. Sometimes it's on microfilm. Same process. You're just combing through tons and tons and tons of stuff. I always call it painting for gold. You're just hoping that there's something cool, but a lot of times there isn't. But when you do find something, it's usually pretty good. And an archive worker at that archive suggests that they go to the main city government archive. So again, if you go to these places and you're nice and polite, people will help you out. So they knew this archive existed. It sounds like they didn't know this other archive existed, but you play nice with the folks you're talking to, and they're like, oh yeah, go check this other place, and you go over there. And in that archive, I guess there were records about the local city government during the Soviet era, and there was one document jumped out. The title: Documents about the Development of Friendly Relations of the City of Yaroslavl with the City of Burlington in 1988. Well, you definitely want to look at that. They had to wait a few days to see it, so I guess they went back to Moscow and then went back on Tuesday, March 3rd. So this was on Super Tuesday when they actually got their eyes on it. And that happens a lot too, where you make a plan when you do field research. You go there, and sometimes you find things you didn't know existed. People have to process documents, process your requests or something. You can't always get things when you want it, so you have to be flexible. The ledger on the inside front cover showed that no one had ever checked it out. So again, if you are industrious, you can get your eyes on some things that no one ever looked at before. Some pages were redacted for personal information, which sounds like maybe Russian law is similar to American law over here. We have different privacy acts where personal information can't be released. It has to go through a redaction process. That's normal. But the rest presented an unexplored trove of material: telex messages from Mr. Sanders, his letters in the original English and in Russian translation, and pages upon pages reflecting the Soviets' careful preparation for his visit. There was also the hotel check-in slip from Mr. Sanders and his wife, Jane, room 415 of the Yubiliana Hotel on the waterfront. Out of curiosity, our photographer and I stopped by. The manager offered to show us the room. In the 1980s, the nicest suite in the town's swankiest hotel. As we entered the room, the manager said, "Your future president slept in this bed." So, is seeing the hotel room, is it really essential to the story? Not really. It's just cool, though, when you find I don't know, how old is that? More than 30-year-old hotel check-in slip. They're really good record keepers there. So I love this stuff. It's just it's just a great story. I didn't know, I had no idea you had these kind of archives in Russia. But it's I just keep coming down to the fact that no one ever looked at this stuff before. And so obviously, in a political world, wonder how does this story play? If you're younger, I guess if you're a millennial or younger, I guess you would have no memories of the Soviet era, of the Cold War. If you're a person of a certain age like me, I'm a Gen Xer, I definitely remember the Cold War. I was a kid during the 80s, a very, and then if you're even older than that, like my parents, where you grew up where you were doing duck and cover drills and you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, this story probably has a lot more resonance with you, and the whole matter of the Soviet trip has a lot more resonance than with someone younger who just has no memory of the Soviet Union. I mean, obviously the modern Russia, but it's a totally different world that we're living in now. I mean, and actually I have some fond memories from the 80s of the Cold War era movies, like Red Dawn and Firefox or Clint Eastwood. We went into the Soviet Union and stole a high-tech fighter plane that they had. Red Dawn, we had high school kids who helped win World War III. And then so if you are one of those people who is, like I said, of a certain age, and you hear words like Soviet Union and propaganda, those bring back memories of that time. And then if you're a Trump voter, a Trump supporter, and you've heard a lot about Russia, you're probably saying, well, look, this guy actually went to the Soviet Union, and from the Soviet perspective, they're using words like propaganda regarding the Sanders coming to the Soviet Union, and then subsequently there was a trip of Russians who went to Vermont and also got to to meet Ben and Jerry. So if you have any memories of those times, or you don't have any of the memories of those times, please leave a comment. I'd love to hear your perspective on that time. And then there's also plenty of people who lived through the Cold War and they don't care. You know, I mean, that's politics. But I appreciate your time listening. Like I said, please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Let me know what you thought about this. I'm going to do more videos explaining the opposition research process and its application to not just politics, but to a lot of different things. Appreciate your time. Thanks.